Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Depends on where you watch us today. We are here today with a new ILEM Istanbul Talks with you. As you know, we wanted to make this program 2 weeks ago, but we had to postpone at the last minute due to a health problem with our speaker, Andy Rumar. Sorry for this again, but Alhamdulillah, he's okay now. Let me introduce myself firstly. I am Ahmet Köroğlu. I am assistant professor at Istanbul University. And with this, I am board member of ILEM and the coordinator of these talks, ILEM Istanbul Talks. I want to briefly tell something about ILEM Istanbul Talks. ILEM is willing to share on intellectual experience with academics, researchers, and intellectuals with all around the world from different geographies. And ILEM wants to benefit from the other experiences from all around the world as well. For this, we want to start a new talk series with the name ILEM Istanbul Talks. And we believe that the ILEM Istanbul Talks will help us to communicate and cooperate with other international academicians or academic institutions. We are also hoping to meet and have new partners from all around the world in order to establish good relations with others. And now I want to introduce our speaker and moderator very shortly. Firstly, our moderator, Dr. Oğuzhan Göksel. Dr. Oğuzhan Göksel is assistant professor of political economy at the Department of Economics, Marmara University in Turkey. He is also the editor-in-chief of the UK-based journal New Middle Eastern Studies. He completed his multidisciplinary PhD degree on political science and political economy at Durham University, United Kingdom, in 2015. Göksel's works have been published in various edited books and international peer-reviewed journals, such as Mediterranean Politics, British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, and Turkish Studies. Göksel's main areas of research are modernization and non-Western modernities, political economy and development, foreign policy analysis, and comparative political economy. And our respected speaker, Andrew March, Hocam. Andrew March is an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He previously taught in the political science department at Yale University and has taught Islamic law at Yale and NYU law schools. His research or teaching interests are in the areas of political philosophy, Islamic law and political thought, religion and political theory. He is graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Oxford. He has published articles on religion, liberalism, and Islamic law in the American Political Science Review, Philosophy and Public Affairs, Journal of Political Philosophy, European Journal of International Law, and Islamic Law and Society, among other publications. While visiting scholars during the 2018-2019 academic year, he completed his book, Manuscript on the Problem of Divine and Popular Sovereignty in the Modern Islamic Thought, The Caliphate of Man, which was published by Harvard University Press in September 2019, and we'll talk about this book today. Thank you again for all the listeners, and welcome our respected speaker, Andrew March, and our moderator, Oğuzhan Göksel. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmet Köroğlu. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to our dear speaker, Professor March, who's here with us today. We are really honored, and we have the pleasure to host him. we are pleased to learn that his health situation has been resolved and that we are back on track with our program. So as Dr. Köroğlu mentioned, our speaker will mostly tell us about his wonderful book, The Caliphate of Man. And I think that work, but of course, his many other works will be at the center of our discussions today. And as you may know from the previous talks that we had, we are kind of, rather than monologues, we are trying to encourage lively dialogue. So hopefully I'll succeed in this mission today. Professor Maç, I would like to give you the floor, but I would like to start this discussion with a question, actually. While I was reading your book, The Caliphate of Man, which is a really impressive work, I was reminded of an interesting incident. So, as you would know, a couple of years ago in Turkey, we had a military coup attempt on the night of 15th July in 2016, quite a tragic incident. Well, thankfully, though, it failed, and the democratic regime somehow survived thanks to the protesters' efforts, people who lost their lives to preserve Turkish democracy. But it was a heated moment in Turkey in the following days after the coup, and I was driving to the university that I was working at that time. This incident that I experienced happened in the streets of Ümraniye, a neighborhood in Istanbul which is known to be a bit conservative. And traditionally, though, it's a neighborhood that has been supportive of the ruling party in Turkey, the Conservative Justice and Development Party. But on the walls of this neighborhood, and it was on my way, someone wrote President Erdogan's sentence. President Erdogan reiterating the rule of the people and the principle of democracy. He was saying over and over and again those days, sovereignty belongs to the people. You know, someone wrote Erdogan, double dot, and sovereignty belongs to the people. I remember because I took photo, but someone else came, crossed the people, and wrote sovereignty belongs to Allah. And I thought this was very interesting because, you know, here we have a government which is known to be conservative, which is known to promote a pro-Muslim agenda since they came to power, and they've been ruling a long time. And even that government, and in particular political discourse they used, was kind of criticized. This dedication of that government to people's rule was criticized in this neighborhood known to be conservative, perhaps by a more strict understanding of Islamism, a more political Islamist direction, and it's like has been corrected, you know. So I thought this would be an interesting way to start. So in light of this, what do you think about the way in which the concept sovereignty has evolved in Islamic political thought?
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for that anecdote. And thank you very, very much for hosting me. Thank you also to Hocam Ahmet, who is, I think, standing by. And thank you very much for your time and your patience and your generosity. I would like to clarify that 2 weeks ago, it was not so much a health issue as a health solution. I was recovering from my second vaccine shot. And so I was having some of those symptoms, and I wanted to be at my best. So I also thank you for your patience and being willing to have me on despite that. So that's a wonderful anecdote. Thank you very, very much. It's actually the perfect segue to my talk, and in fact, to what my 2019 book was about. What I would say that both of those things have in common is that whether you're talking about the sovereignty of God or the sovereignty of the people, neither God, with apologies to those that believe in inayet, or divine providence and active intervention in the world, nor the people is capable of acting directly in representing their own sovereignty. So if you speak about something like divine sovereignty or the sovereignty of the emperor, or perhaps to a certain extent the sovereignty of the caliph or the sultan or the padishah. The person of the padishah can be found, can be located. The will can be represented and enunciated. Others can be seen as direct appointees of the will of a king or a sultan or emperor or padishah because there was an active, actual, identifiable, singular agent that is capable of enunciating a will. In the case of both God and the people, neither can be present directly at any moment. Neither can speak at any given moment in that agent's own voice and will. Neither can actively identify its will or interest or command in any given situation. And so both sovereignties have to be represented. So when you speak about somebody like Erdogan and the AKP, yes, of course, as you mentioned, it is a party that evolved from an Islamist background and appeals to religious values and a conservative population, but it's also kind of a populist party. It claims to represent the people. And so therefore, when you said that there was a graffito on this wall that's saying that a quote by Erdogan that the rule belongs to the people, I was not surprised, because many Islamist parties have developed as representing themselves as the voice of the people precisely because they see themselves as opposing some other kind of alien authoritarian regime, whether it's a colonial foreign regime or a domestic military regime or a regime that is portrayed as representing only a small elite secular portion of the population. And so the language of popular sovereignty and the language of populism is one that is unsurprisingly associated with Islamist parties as well as other kinds of populist parties. But of course, as you point out, the origin of these parties is also in some kind of claim to be restoring a source of authority separate from the people, separate from the state, separate from any kind of human human authority. So, in fact, if you don't mind, I think that's a perfect way to segue into some of the notes that I had for my talk today. The way, in fact, that I wanted to begin is by pointing out first that traditionally speaking, that is, if you go back to the 1930s to the 1960s and 70s, the high point of the development of Islamist ideology, modern political Islam is built on a grand idea. And that grand idea is exactly what you said, the idea of divine sovereignty, or hekimiyet in Turkish, and more importantly, the sufficiency of the Sharia. So it is not just that there is some kind of law or morality or human rights that at certain points is set there as a check or constraint on the law of the state, but that one of the ideas that was present in thinkers like Maududi and Qutb and Khomeini and others is that the Sharia covers everything. It's comprehensive and it is sufficient. There is no need for any other kind of authority or lawmaking source of norms than the divine law. Now, at the same time, we notice, and again, here your anecdote is, it's almost as if I told you to say this, that Islamic political thinkers ranging from certain kinds of traditionalists to theorists of political Islam, and by which I mean, since the Arab Spring and particularly since the coup of 2013, it has become very, very popular to make a distinction between neo-traditionalists and Islamists. So there are many, as we know, of the authoritarian regimes in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, that are claiming the mantle of traditionalism, that we have the ulama, we have the scholars, and they have the true traditional doctrine of obedience to the Wali al-Amr and focusing on piety and morality as opposed to politics. And part of their the rhetorical strategy is to portray groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the AKP as belonging to some distinct ideology of Islamism that has nothing to do with traditional Islam. This is, it doesn't come from nowhere, but the sharp distinction between these two views is also quite new. So throughout the period of, let's just say the 1950s until the Arab revolts of 2011, the boundaries between these views was not so distinct. So you had thinkers in all of these groups that, while they were proclaiming divine sovereignty and the sufficiency of the Sharia, were also proclaiming commitment to a certain kind of popular sovereignty. Or they would sometimes even use the word siyadat al-ummah or siyadat al-sha'ab, right? So using the language of sovereignty, although usually a different word than the word that's used for divine sovereignty. Now, what's interesting and what provides the impetus and the inspiration for my book is that throughout the 20th century, the claim of popular sovereignty was not only grounded in, let's say, a modern political commitment or in specific kinds of juridical doctrines, but was grounded in a very specific theological claim that the people at large has been designated God's Khalifa, God's Caliph, his deputy, his vicegerent on earth. And so this is a very, very modern interpretation of certain verses from the Quran. For example, chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30, proclaiming that God says, I will make a Khalifa, or sometimes plural Khala'if, on the earth. And never until the 20th century was this interpreted to mean the entire people as the custodians or the recipients or the repositories of God's political and legal authority. And yet somehow in the 20th century, that is precisely what happened. And here's the interesting part. This doctrine was not developed by secularists or by modernizers or by those that were trying to argue for a separation of Islam and politics. It was developed precisely by Islamists like Maududi and Qutb. It was they that put into what I call the modern Islamic intellectual bloodstream the idea that the divine caliphate, the deputyship or the vicegerency of God on earth belongs not to a single office or person, but to the entire people. And so that's, I'm not going to call it a paradox. I'm going to call it a kind of complexity and sophistication of modern Islamist thought. That just like in the anecdote that you said, that at the same time, sovereignty belongs to Allah and to the people. How is this the case, right? So in the case of your anecdote, the person might have added Allah and not just crossed out, is it Hulk or something like that was said in the thing? Okay, so so that's the background, right? That's the sort of the larger story that I pick up with, and what I argue is that political Islamists in particular regard these two commitments, divine and popular sovereignty, not in tension, but as implied by the same commitment. That the idea that the people is God's caliph on earth represents both the idea that God is sovereign and the idea that the people is God's representative and therefore not sovereign over God, but sovereign over anybody else that would claim to speak in God's name. And ultimately, I would say by the 1980s and 90s, with thinkers like the Sudanese Tourabi and the Tunisian Rashid El-Ghannouchi, whom I work on most closely, you develop an ideal theory of a very, very distinct regime type that I call Islamic democracy. And I call this Islamic democracy to distinguish it from Islam and democracy, but also to distinguish it from Muslim democracy. So I think you would agree that when the AKP first came to power, it was very, very popular for them to say, we're not Islamists, we are Muslim Democrats. You don't have to be scared of us. We're not trying to bring about a revolution. We're not trying to bring about a regime like in Iran. We are one party that wants to democratize Turkey with a conservative religious referent or slant, and we're going to refer to ourselves as Muslim Democrats. Now, that is the fate of parties in Tunisia, like Ennahda, and other parties in Malaysia and Indonesia and so forth. But that's what I'm going to conclude with if I have enough time. But that's not my primary focus. I want to stress that what I am primarily interested in is not this turn to Muslim democracy, but to this vision of an ideal regime type that I call Islamic democracy, in which both God and the people are sovereign at the same time. So that's the background to my book, and what I'm interested in is, where does this come from, and what is involved in saying, in an Islamic framework, in a conservative Islamic framework, that the Sharia is supreme, but the people also has ultimate political authority. How can you hold both those commitments at once? Now, what are some of the historical premises to this question? First, that popular sovereignty was not always just there, that it required inventing. This is not something that would have been familiar to Muslim political thinkers, let's say, before the 1900s. So many of the young Ottomans, right, Namik Kemal in particular, will speak in the language of popular sovereignty, but they're amongst the first. And so what's interesting is that this is a commitment that required inventing. And it is not just simply a fact about Islamic political thought throughout all time and space. If it is being invented, and if popular sovereignty is being asserted as a primary commitment, what is it replacing? It's replacing, on my reading, a very, very dominant view, or a very, very dominant mode of rule in most Muslim regimes before the, let's say, the 19th and 20th centuries, that I call dualism. That Muslim polities like the Ottoman Empire, like Morocco, like Persia, were ruled in a kind of condominium by, on the one hand, the executive rulers, the Sultan, the Bey, the Padishah, whatever you want to call him, who not only issued public policy, but had his own distinct realm of lawmaking. Of course, the Ottomans were the ones that perfected this, resulting in Qanun law and separate realms of juridical authority. But they didn't claim to rule everything. They didn't, by and large, replace the family law, the commercial law, all other kinds of laws that regulated the day-to-day life of the population. And this was obviously done by the scholars acting as muftis and judges. So the important thing here is that in pre-modern Islamic polities, you had two distinct rationales of law and governance. On the one hand, traditional Islamic law, or fiqh, and the law of public interest, siyasa or qanun. Now, where is the ummah in all of this? The ummah is kind of there in the background, because for Sunnis, of course, even the caliph is not appointed by God, but comes from the people in a certain way. But the people is primarily present when it is represented by the group known as the people who loose and bind, or the Ahlul Hal wal Aqd. So just to give one very, very quick example for a Turkish audience, I'm sure you all know that when it was time to depose a sultan, this was primarily done by the Janissaries. And so the Janissaries, of course, the troops that were there to serve and protect the sultan, also regarded themselves as the only ones that had the capacity to remove a sitting sultan. And they would often justify this by saying that in this time and place, we are the ones that represent, along with the scholars, along with the viziers, along with others, the people who loose and bind. So in the broad sense, the people is present as represented, but it's never implied that the people are actively going to participate or elect rulers or participate in lawmaking or something like that. Now, I mentioned that this idea of the God's caliph on earth comes from the Quran. So this is not itself invented, but it was never interpreted as grounding something like the popular origin of political authority. Rather, it was often used to justify the office of the caliphate. So the office of a single person governing God's community, the Ummah, was often justified on the basis of these, because some of these verses in the Quran refer to certain prophets like David and others, and so it is seen to refer to a particular office of rulership. Let's say a better example is that after and around the time of the abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate and then Caliphate, when thinkers and activists like Rashid Ridda were trying to reconstitute the Caliphate in the Cairo Caliphate Conference of 1926 and so forth, and Ridda published his book El Khilafa, which was a series of essays on the office of the Caliphate. As his epigraph, he included the same verse from the Quran, 230, and he used this as late as the 1920s. And Ridda, of course, is a modernist and is part of this modern Salafiyya theology. He used this as proof that the office of the caliphate is a requirement on the Muslim community. He was not using it as an argument that the people is now sovereign in the absence of legitimate authority. Second, this verse is traditionally interpreted to refer to something like mankind's dominion over the earth. So we have inherited the earth, and mankind has stewardship over the earth, but it's not the same thing as political authority over rulers and other representatives. And finally, this idea of a caliphate in some Sufi philosophical and ethical thought refers to moral perfection. So if you as an individual are working to discipline your soul, your nafs, and you are working on your moral perfection, you may aspire to the status of being Khalifatullah fil ard. But it is not reference to any kind of political authority, but to a status of moral excellence or moral perfection. Okay, now, so that's the kind of background. That's why this is an interesting question. What does it mean to invent this concept in modern Islamic political thought? Now, in addition to this, we have some conceptual premises. If you have Islamist thinkers, and there are many, who have wanted to say, don't worry, we Islamists are not opposed to democracy. In fact, we believe in the sovereignty of the people. What does this mean? What does this mean to say the people is sovereign as opposed to merely saying the people has a right to be represented, or the people can participate in government? Sovereignty is a very, very strong word. So what do I take that to mean? First, sovereignty refers to the original right to constitute and authorize the use of political power. So in political theory, we sometimes refer to the idea of constituent authority. So why is a constitution legitimate? Why are certain offices legitimate? Because they have been authorized by the people through some kind of constituent assembly and a referendum. Second, sovereignty implies, therefore, the ultimate right to legislate and interpret legal commands. If you say that there is an office that has the sole right to legislate and to say what that legislation means, and there is no body above it, that body is sovereign. If there is no office or institution of appeal beyond it, and of course, constituent power itself, or it's sometimes referred to in modern Arabic as sulta ta'sisiyya, right? The authority to establish, constitute political offices is a kind of legislation, right? As I'm sure you all know, before the modern word for constitution, dustur, became widespread, early constitutions were simply known as Qanun Asasi, right? I believe that the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 was simply known as the Qanun Asasi, as just the basic law. So where does this basic law come from? And finally, sovereignty refers to the ultimate power of coercion in, outside, and around the law. Now, what does this mean for Islam? Now, in Islam, if the divine law says that certain kinds of offices are mandatory, for example, the caliphate or the imamate, you might say the people doesn't have constituent authority because it doesn't have the right to say, well, we don't really need an imam or a caliph right now because that was historical. That belongs to the historical aspect of Islamic law and not one of its permanent rulings. And so if you have a theory that says part of what popular sovereignty means is the people is free to decide for itself which kinds of offices and institutions and relationships are most suited for its interest, that does point to a genuine commitment to sovereignty. And in fact, that is what a lot of theorists have said, that while the caliphate is an esteemed institution, that that the people has the authority to decide for itself what kinds of institutions best suit its interest today. Second, any ultimate claim to legislate must reckon with the existence of the divine law in some form. So if the people is going to be sovereign, what relationship does it have to the Sharia, and what relationship does it have to traditional experts in the divine law? And then finally, the divine law cannot enforce itself coercively. So who is authorized to exercise violence and coercion in the name of the divine law? So this gives us a few set of theoretical questions. Can the people enjoy an original right to constitute new forms of political power? Can the people have an ultimate right to legislate if law is divinely revealed and expertly interpreted? 2, does Islam's traditional dualism persist between fiqh and maslaha, or fiqh and siyasa? And can the people be said to be sovereign over the distinction between these two kinds of law, over both kinds of law, over how they are both realized? And thus, how is coercion and violence authorized? And so the ultimate question is not, my question is not, is Islam compatible with democracy, or can Muslims be Democrats? Those are not specific questions. The question that I end up asking is, what kind of democracy and popular sovereignty is imagined by this theology of the caliphate of man? Now, the scope for my argument ranges from Islamic constitutional and political theory since the mid-19th century constitutional movements, with a special focus on the young Ottomans and Tunisian thinkers during this period. But ultimately, I focus on the Tunisian thinker Rashid al-Ghannouchi as a kind of representative of a much larger body of thought, represented by thinkers ranging from Yusuf al-Qaradawi to Hassan al-Turabi, Muhammad Salim al-Awwa, Muhammad Imara, many, many, many thinkers. So I demonstrate in my book that there is a range of concepts and claims that are being asserted very, very consistently by dozens of thinkers. And then I use Ghannouchi as a close reading of what happens when all of these ideas are taken to their logical conclusion. All right, now, how am I doing on time? Would you like to pause there? I was planning on elaborating on some of these things, but I wanted to sort of get your feedback on where we stand.
Thank you so much, Professor March. I think that was an excellent, very informative presentation, and I'm sure our audience have learned a lot and enjoyed it. Yeah, perhaps this could be a little bit of time to give you a break too, and to share some of my thoughts on it. Yeah, I actually really enjoyed reading your work, The Caliphate of Man. And yes, especially I found it enlightening, how you go into many different traditions, and it's very comprehensive in scope. Most of the people who write about Islamic political thought, generally they choose a tradition, a certain strand, and they follow it in a specific, predominantly Muslim country. But your book was extremely impressive for me. in terms of the range of countries that you cover, like Turkey, Iran, Tunisia, etc. As I also worked on these countries myself, I worked on their modernization, but specifically, I looked at how political Islam, capitalism, and democratization interact with each other in Turkey, Iran, Tunisia, Egypt. I was particularly interested in, and of course, our audience would have different interests, so I look forward to receiving questions from them. But I myself was very interested in how you also take the Shia political tradition. So, in your research, have you noticed, and because you talk about this grand idea, how Islamic political actors, thinkers, both on a political movement level, but also on a scholarly clergy level, in their attempt to formulate a modern Islamic polity in different ways, have you noticed a major difference or something visible barrier, or simply some major difference of understanding between the Sunni and Shia political Islamic branches, especially in regards to the Khomeini's thought in comparison to more Sunni-oriented scholars like Qutb or Ghanouchi or others?
You know, yes and no. So obviously the differences are there, and I think we all know what the difference is. That in the theory of Khomeini, Wilayat al-Faqih or Vilayat al-Faqih, there is the claim that since Islam is law, and since Islamic government is law, therefore whoever most knows the law should simply rule. Why would you have an intermediary between the ruler and the law if those two are the same things? Now that is a very, very novel argument, both for Shiism and for Sunnism. I think we're all familiar with the fact that Khomeini's idea was deeply controversial within Shiism, even though it did have its roots in certain kinds of theories of scholarship. Second, obviously, Khomeini justified his argument not only on the basis of a kind of rational syllogism, right? Islam is law. If Islam is law, whoever knows the law should be ruling. The scholars know the law, therefore the scholars should rule. He also had arguments from a distinctly Shia tradition of hadith that say that the imams, in their ghaiba or absence, expressly left their authority to the ulama. Now, that is not an argument that you see in that clear form in Sunnism. In Sunnism, of course, you have similar arguments. You have the argument that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, right? That that the scholars are the legatees of the prophets. They are the ones that inherit the prophet's authority. So there is something of that. You also have the idea that, you know, from Quranic verses like obey the ulil amr, those who have authority, that this refers to the scholars as well as the quote-unquote secular rulers. So the differences are not that radical. That's one point. The second point is that much of modern constitutional theory, the things that are very, very familiar to us, that there should be a Sharia clause in the Constitution, that there should be some special court or body that are meant to adjudicate Sharia compatibility of legislation. Those all are first seen in the Iranian Constitution of 1906 and 1907. So I don't think I'm wrong. I've read the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, and it doesn't have all of the stuff that we are familiar with from 20th century constitutionalism, right? That all laws must be compatible with the Sharia, that there's some body that is set up to check the authority of both the Sultan and the legislature, that the sovereignty belongs to God, right? And it's also not there in the 1861 Tunisian constitution. The ideas may have been present, but I'm saying that the idea that you get in the Pakistani constitution, the Egyptian constitution, many others, that there must be a Sharia compatibility clause, and there must be a a body set up to adjudicate this is first seen in the Persian constitution, and the post-revolutionary Iranian constitution also exemplifies these sorts of things. One final point. While it is not the norm that in Sunni political thought they say that the ulama ought to rule, they do say that ilm, or religious knowledge, is one of the shurut al-imama, one of the conditions for the just ruler. And so, to use an example that nobody wants to use, but when ISIS or Daesh, I don't know how you call them in Turkish, was claiming to reestablish the caliphate, and they wanted to argue that Baghdadi fulfilled all of the conditions of the caliphate, or the shurut al-imama, they tried to say that he had sufficient religious knowledge because he had a PhD in Islamic studies, and that he was capable of issuing fatwas and of issuing edicts and these sorts of things. So there are, of course, very, very important distinctions. But I think that the distinctions are not so sharp that these two bodies of thought are not in the same conversation. One final point about that. It's very common to assert that Shiite political thought held that no political authority was legitimate in the absence of the imam. So nobody had a right to rule. And of course, that's true as a matter of doctrine. But in practice, after the Safavids and the Qajars, you developed, and you see in Shiism, the same kind of theory of dualism, or siyasa shari'ah, that you see in the Sunni tradition. That, okay, you can have a Shah, and he is worthy of a certain kind of obedience, but his authority is not total. He has to leave these sorts of things to the religious scholars and listen to the religious scholars. So ultimately, you arrive at the same destination by, let's say, the 18th and 19th centuries.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think very, very informative answer. Thank you so much. Another question that I had while reading your works, obviously you talk about this concept of, I mean, not you directly, but you also refer to this literature about, you know, the connections, all the debates about Islam and modernity. I myself have worked a lot on this. So obviously, as you highlighted, when we talk of Islamic scholars, the various Islamic political movements, and Islamic world is a very big place. We can't really say that Islamic political thought has been monolithic. It has been nothing like that. There are many different understandings, many different traditions, some constitutionalist, some perhaps more authoritarian, some more democratic, obviously, as we understand those concepts in a Western political thought. But you mentioned that one issue, and this is something that one of your articles published in 2007 deals with. One issue that most people, especially Western, obviously observers, are worried about is what would political and social life be for non-Muslims in an overtly, explicitly Islamic polity, Islamic modernity or democracy, whether it's democracy or not. So according to your research on a number of key Islamic thinkers, in an Islamic polity, how would non-Muslims be treated? And you also talk about Muslims' loyalty, for instance, to non-Muslim states and so on. So there's the issue of, I think, two issues that I often encounter whenever we, in Turkey, but also beyond Turkey, when we talk about Islamic modernity or Islamic polity, non-Muslims and non-believers, obviously. How would they be treated, you think? Or who or which scholars we can look at when we talk about this issue in terms of offering a more established, concrete vision?
So the first response to that is, what is a non-Muslim? Now, in the Islamic juridical tradition, up until the mid-19th century, it was simply assumed that everybody belonged to a confessional community. And so you belong to a confessional community, whatever else you might believe. And so your identity group or your status group is defined by your by a specific kind of religious community. So normally when you talk about non-Muslims in an Islamic state, the default assumption is to imagine that you're talking about Jews and Christians, people of the book. And there, the language is very, very, very consistent, right? You have a dhimma contract, they have certain kinds of rights, they have certain kinds of obligations, they have exemptions from other kinds of obligations. There's a distinction perhaps between a private sphere and a public sphere. There are things that they can do in their churches, in their shops, in their schools, as opposed to in the marketplace, or so on and so forth. And, you know, there's a kind of apologetic Islamic literature that simply says, well, this is no problem, right? Everybody has their rights, and you can worship, and you don't have to convert to Islam. You just have to not offend the wider community. But this is an assumption that all people want is to worship God monotheistically in a particular way. And in the modern period, that's obviously simply not the case. So 2 points to sort of address this in a concise way. One, many people do not identify as either Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, whatever, but non-Muslim in the sense of being secular or not interested in conforming to certain kinds of religious prescriptions. And it's much harder to say that this is a matter of principled right, that you have a right to publicly not identify with Islamic norms, right? Now, there are questions of what you do, toleration, when does certain kinds of acts become part of the public sphere and when are they not? But the idea that the problem of non-Muslims includes secular people, atheists, feminists, those who may come from a Muslim background, but simply do not see Islam as an origin of their moral commitments. That is a harder question to address directly. It's much easier to just say, all pluralism is a matter of confession. And I'll give you an example. Even Ghannouchi, whom I've worked on and with the most closely, in the 1970s and 80s, he still subscribed. You know, Tunisia was a secular state from the 1950s, equal citizenship. He still subscribed in the 80s to a view that had differential citizenship, right? That the primary citizenship basis was Islam, and that others, Jews, Christians, but also perhaps secularists, communists, could be tolerated, but they were not going to hold certain kinds of offices, or they were not going to participate in the same way. And he says, yeah, I had to change that, right? I had to move to a conception of simply equal citizenship. Everybody is a member and a citizen, and that has nothing to do with your religious affiliation. The second point is that you framed this in terms of non-Muslims. On my reading, and I'm very, very happy to be corrected, I think it's much more common to talk about these things in terms of acts as opposed to a status or identity as a non-Muslim. So what can you say in public? Can you be an apostate? What are the limits of speech? What are the limits of dress? What are the limits of criticism? Can Muslim women marry non-Muslim men? These are the kinds of things that when we say, well, what about non-Muslims? We mean people that may have Muslim parents, but do not identify with Islam. And this may manifest in the realm of personal freedoms, conscience, choice, expression, how you participate in the public sphere. And so on my reading, a lot of the way in which Islamist thinkers address this is through specific treatments of these kinds of acts. What do we do with the classical rules on apostasy? What do we do with the classical rules on marriage? Those kinds of things. And only after that, I think, do you find thinkers that will say, Islam is not necessarily the dominant, hegemonic, sovereign framing of state and society. So this turn to Muslim democracy in Tunisia, I don't know about the Turkish thinkers as well, that's what they end up saying, which is, you know what? The original state in Medina that the Prophet established was a pluralist state. It had Jews, Muslims, others. All you had to do was cooperate on worldly matters, security and so forth, and your ethical identity was not crucial, and that's what politics is. So that is the way that I think this ends up evolving, is to a kind of post-sovereigntist theory of politics, in which politics is no longer seen through the lens of applying the Sharia and shaping people's moral character.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is exactly what I was going to ask next. Also, to give you a chance to kind of conclude your okay. Arguments. In that, in your book's concluding sections, you make this very interesting, very original argument, just as you made it now, about post-sovereign kind of understanding. So, building a genuine, and I emphasize that, Islamic political system, and being an Islamic democracy of some kind based on pluralism, as we have discussed, and as we also understand this concept in the West. Can these two objectives be consistent or not? In what and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I understood from the book's conclusion was that I think you imply that it may not be so realistic to say that it is consistent, these two objectives.
What are the two objectives? Pluralism and...
building a genuine Islamic political system and a pluralism-based kind of Islamic democracy. And I think, or please correct me, you say it's not that it may not be so realistic given the realities on the ground in Muslim-majority societies, and perhaps, as you also, I think, highlighted, Islamism may have to remain an ideal rather than practice.
So thank you for that question. Every system of thought, that even ones that base itself on pluralism, have to have some limits to pluralism. And so I don't know if the audience is familiar with, let's say, theories of political agonism as opposed to deliberative democracy. But thinkers like Chantal Mouffe and Laclau and so forth that say, this liberalism, it claims to be pluralist, but it's making everybody speak the same language and arrive at a moral consensus. Politics is more about agonistic contestation. Even those people, they have pretty strict limits of what they think is acceptable. So it's, if you accept the Constitution and non-violent politics, then, that's a big if, right? So everybody has limits to pluralism in practice. Second, everybody has limits to pluralism at the level of epistemology or metaphysics. And so, let's say liberal pluralism, like you find in Habermas or Rawls, wants to say that pluralism is the basic condition of intellectual life and social life, and that's where you have to begin. We are not all going to agree on a worldview, on a metaphysical view, on religious truth. And so therefore, justice has to begin with that as a constraint. But they also say that everybody has to recognize that pluralism as a fact. If you don't recognize the legitimacy of other points of view, then you're being unreasonable. So that may be acceptable, or that may have its reasons, but it is also saying, let's say very traditional dogmatic religions are making a mistake about epistemology. I would also like to think that those kinds of views regard doctrines of racial supremacy or gender supremacy as completely beyond the pale and unreasonable. So every theory of pluralism has to have its own limits. Now, I don't particularly think that that's hypocritical or that that's being in bad faith. It's just a fact. Similarly for Islam, how far is pluralism able to go, and how far does it have to go? Does it go to the extent of saying that it is reasonable, epistemologically and rationally, to, let's say, deny the existence of God? That Islam and theism as such are just one other way of seeing the cosmos. That's very, very hard, right? It's very easy to say we can argue with atheists, we can debate them, we don't have to kill them, we can have tea with them. But it's another thing to say their view is plausible, and so therefore politics has to account for them. So I will give you an anecdote of my conversations with Ghannouchi, in which he's all pluralism, pluralism, pluralism. We can even work with communists. We have no problem. And then I will say, Immanuel Kant had an argument about the antinomies of reason. It's very similar to the medieval Islamic philosophical and theological claim known as takaffu al-adilla, right? That the equivalency of arguments. And Kant argued that there are equally good reasons for the creation of the world and the eternity of the world. Equally good arguments for a divine creator and for no divine creator. And he just said, Kant ghalat. Kant was wrong. So he doesn't think that at the level of epistemology, non-theist views are equal. He will also write that human rights have to ultimately depend on a theistic view, that mankind in fitra yearns for God. So I don't know what to make of this. You might say it doesn't matter, right? Like, who cares? As long as people act in certain kinds of ways. To have a belief is to believe that your belief is true. So why would you expect Muslims to say that non-Islam is reasonable, right? That's incoherent, but it's also unnecessary. If you adopt a political practice that does not involve persecuting people, who cares if there is the same deep theory of this that Rawls and Habermas and Kant and others have? So it may be a workable arrangement that is not either deeply theorized or not theorized in the same way. So you may be familiar with the expression. In fact, Kant wrote an essay like this. It may work in theory, but will it work in practice? Right? Like they say about communism. Oh, communism is great in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. So I say it the other way around, right? So theories of Muslim democracy and theories of pluralism may work in practice even if they don't work in theory, right? They may be practicable ways of operating in politics even if the theory is very thin and not particularly convincing.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. This I think was a lovely way to conclude. Let me see if we have received some questions. No. So with your permission, either we can conclude or I can give the floor once again to you if you wish to add a few more sentences or conclude your thoughts.
I'm very, very grateful for this. I am really appreciative anytime somebody reads my book or even skims it. And your questions were excellent. They were very, very perceptive. And I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to speak to you and have a chance to discuss this.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a pleasure for me to read your work, your book, but also a number of your articles. It was I had a really pleasant time. And thank you so much for being here with us, especially in this time, as the whole globe is going through a difficult time. We are all, honestly, we feel privileged to have had to honor you, or for you to give us the honor. Hopefully one day when this whole pandemic situation improves, we can meet in person too. So I would like to thank to you, to our organizers, İLEM, to Dr. Ahmet Köroğlu, and to our kind audience who in Turkey, it's like moving towards 10 p.m. right now, that were with us, but perhaps our audience is connecting us through a number of countries, including US, but also many others. So we are very grateful for your time, Professor, and to our dear audience. I wish you a pleasant morning or evening, depending on where you are. Wish you all the best. Take care.
Teşekkür ederim. And next year in Istanbul.
İnşallah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.